Hi, this is the second lecture for psychological foundations of musical behaviors, and today we're going to be talking about the origins of music and looking at music and evolution, how music may have come to be as part of a human behavior. So we're going to start off with talking a little bit about Darwin. Um, all the way back in the 1870s, this idea of looking at what evolutionary purpose music has was already being discussed. And so Darwin himself, he believed that there must be some evolutionary value of music for it to be possessed by humans. He says in one of his in The Descent of Man, he says, as neither the enjoyment nor the capacity of producing notes are faculties of the least direct use to man, in reference to his ordinary habits of life, they must be ranked among the most mysterious with which he is endowed. So saying even though we don't really know why music has a purpose, it is certainly a mysterious thing that we do, that we are musical beings. He then says they are present, though in a very rude and, as it appears, almost latent condition in men of all races, even the most savage. So a little un-PC, but he's saying that in many civilizations we see music being a part of it. Whether or not the half-human progenitors of man possessed, like the before-mentioned gibbon, the capacity of producing and no doubt of appreciating musical notes, we have every reason to believe that man possessed these faculties at a very remote period, for singing and music are extremely ancient arts. So he's believing that our evolutionary progenitors, our evolutionary forefathers, that they most likely had some sort of um, musical behaviors for us to be able to be musical now. So while Darwin, he presents this, or just ideas, that's not really even an argument because he just says, I think that's how it is. Some people don't necessarily agree with him. More recently, Steven Pinker, he's a evolutionary thinker and scientist. He doesn't agree with Darwin at all. He believes that that musical behaviors just seems to be something that came out of other evolutionary processes. And what Pinker says in his book, How the Mind Works, which was published in 1997, he says, but if music confers no survival advantage, where does it come from and why does it work? I suspect that music is auditory cheesecake and an exquisite confection crafted to tickle the sensitive spots of at least 6 of our mental faculties. So he's suggesting that music is essentially a mental cheesecake, that for some reason it gives us pleasure, and for that reason we keep it around, and we have developed these musical skills and behaviors so that our brain will be positively affected, and that um, we pursue musical behaviors in our lives. Now, when we talk about evolution, we need to talk a little bit about some of the terminology. And um, evolution can kind of be boiled down to like the reasons why characteristics exist within different organisms is for sexual selection, meaning that it is something that will help produce. It will affect reproduction. So, for instance, if mice can have many cycles of offspring, then that's a sexual selection trait, which will allow them to make sure that they stick around. So that's kind of sexual selection is a way to help make sure that things will stick around. Natural selection is when organisms take on a trait in order so that they survive. So, for instance, a tiger getting its stripes is so that in the jungle it will be camouflaged and so that it won't be noticed. So it's not necessarily that adaptation um, doesn't affect its sticking around. As far as reproduction is concerned, it's more about for survival. Now, when we talk about adaptation, if an organism adapts itself, that it needs to be for an essential reason. Um, So, like I said, the tiger taking on its stripes, that was an adaptation so that it would not be seen. It would be camouflaged, and that it would survive. Um, other traits that if they take on other traits that are not essential, it's normally an issue of what is called exaptation. That's exaptation, exaptation. And what normally that means is that an organism takes on a trait, it adapts for one reason, but ends up allowing the organism to do something else instead. So, for instance, an example of exaptation is a bird. Feathers are believed to be originally adapted onto birds as a form of insulation, as to keep them warm in order to survive. Um, so the original adaptation was for insulation rather than for flight. But for many birds, they continued to adapt with their feathers so that they could fly. And that's a reason why some birds are flightless, but they still have feathers. You know, all birds have feathers, but not all birds fly. So it's likely that the adaptation was for insulation, and then it was an exaptation that birds use feathers. They adapted their feathers in order to fly. And so some could make an argument that perhaps musical behaviors in humans is an exaptation of something else. So when we talk about music and evolution, there are some challenges to us really understanding, um, of really getting to the nitty gritty of how where the origins of music came from, or what purpose the earliest music really played in human life. Um, and some of the challenges are that there's a lack of a clear definition of what music is. So, what is music? What isn't music? What was music hundreds of thousands of years ago? Um, we're still answering that question of exactly what is music now. Also, there's a lack of a clear, obvious survival benefit. We don't rest, there are very few circumstances in the modern world, much less in the earlier stages of human development, where music would help someone survive a situation. So so that's another reason why it's the reason that music exists is not very clear cut. And also, another challenge for really understanding this is that there's while there is some research that looks at research across cultures and across species, it's we there's very little of it, and so we're still trying to figure out what everything means in the research that we do have. So the question then becomes, is music an evolutionary adaptation? Did, at some point in our evolution as humans, did we become musical because for some reason it helped us survive? And there are several different theories on this, and we're going to talk about those. There's essentially um, five theories. There's one for mating and sexual selection. There's a theory for social bonding, or dealing with emotions. There's one for social coordination and cohesion. There's a theory on parent-infant bonding, and then lastly that it's linked to language evolution. So I'm going to talk about each one briefly. So the theories for mate selection, it kind of goes along with what the reading was for this module, where it kind of shows that the animal kingdom, there's a lot of different sounds and ways that creatures and organisms, they use sound in order to attract a mate. And so the hypothesis that at some point in early human development, that humans adapted a similar thing where they made sounds in order to attract mates, and that could eventually have turned into some sort of music behavior. Um, The it, there's little no, there's again there's not this is just a theory. There's really no evidence that this happened, but it's a valid argument to make. Another argument is looking at how social bonding could be could have been the source for musical behaviors in humans. And yeah, this idea, this is kind of, if you, in the reading, the Hodges reading, it talks about a unique mode of knowing. And what that little section talks about is that as humans live together, which they have to in order to survive, we're social creatures. Um, we have to live together in order to survive. That perhaps music was a way for us to be able to live together. Um, and it uses the analogy of the lions, that they have these tiffs about, when after a hunt, but then they make up and then they can live together. So it's kind of that idea that music provides an outlet to deal with aggression, to deal with grief, to deal with joy as a group, and socially that then the group can bond together. Um, So there's so this idea of a unique mode of knowing is that music can be an outlet for understanding emotions um, and living socially with other people that may cause you to have various emotions. So that could be another source for music development in humans. Another way to think about it is that music could have been a source for social coordination and cohesion. This is similar, but it's slightly different in that it could be that music allowed the earliest humans to do tasks together. For instance, if they were kind of like work songs, if they were able to farm or to build something, um, that the music could help aid that. Um, you know, also, there's kind of a hypothesis that perhaps music was used for warfare, in order to kind of coalesce a group of people against the neighboring tribe. That this was a way to kind of create cohesion um, amongst the humans, or it was a way to help facilitate tasks to be done. So that's another way that music could the survival purpose for music. One of the more one of the more uh, for me at least, the more believable or more um, feel like more valid theories of the purpose of music really comes from parent-infant bonding. Um, in the text, it talks about that, when children are born, they are not fully developed. Their brain is not fully developed. I mean, it's not fully developed until their early 20s, but that's another story. But really, that they cannot survive without their mother um, for an extended period of time after they're born, and so um, that music could have become a it could have been brought about from this parent-infant bonding. And in the text, it talks about infant-directed speech, or what we call more uh, more like a nickname. We call it motherese, and that's where you kind of have this over accentuated kind of pitch um, to speaking. So like when you say, "Oh, look at the baby," "Oh, how you doing?" Talking to a baby. I kind of talk to my dog that way. But who's been a good baby? That kind of thing. Where there's a lot of pitch variation that this seems to naturally kind of go into becoming very musical because there's much more melodic contour than what we have in just regular speech. Um, so that's another theory for the evolutionary basis of music, is that it kind of came out of this came out of this infant-directed speech idea. And lastly, and this is similar, is that it's probably, or they could be linked to language evolution. Um, and this probably has the most hard science evidence for this, because when you look at the brain functionings, or the brain activation with musical behaviors, they reside in a lot of the same places that uh, language activation, or when you speak or do some sort of language tasks that are at where the brain is activated. So there's a little more there's more evidence on that front for this idea that language and music kind of evolved together. Um, and along with that, when you think about just speaking in general, there is already a rhythm, there is already pitch. So it kind of makes sense that that there might be kind of this two-way street where language and music kind of evolve together. Now, there are other ways of thinking about it, and that are similar, that maybe music doesn't play a evolutionary purpose at all. Kind of going back to Pinker's idea of, well, music is really just mental cheesecake. And one of those ideas is that that music is a part of the Knapp's hypothesis. Knapp's hypothesis is non-adaptive pleasure seeking. So it means that we took this on, even though it doesn't really help us survive or doesn't help us, to reproduce, but it is just a pleasure-seeking activity. We have a chemical reaction in our brain when we do have pleasurable experiences. Dopamine is released, and so we like it, and so it doesn't really serve a purpose, but we continue to pursue it. Pinker kind of presents a multi-modal piggybacking idea, where it's, there are all these other things that music activates, and so like music itself has piggybacked off on something that is evolutionarily purposeful. So, it could be one of those theories I was just talking about, but, maybe it was the infant-directed speech, and then, after generations of just, speaking to babies, then lullabies then developed, and then singing and that sort of thing. Maybe that's the multimodal piggybacking hypothesis. And then Brown in 2000, he presents an argument that music is a byproduct of language acquisition, and he calls all of this musi-language development. So kind of a lot of these ideas are being it's interesting because they're kind of coming from different camps, saying, oh, this is from evolutionary purposes, or no, it doesn't really serve an evolutionary purpose, but it piggybacked off of something else. But we're kind of talking about all the same stuff, regardless whether you think it served its own purpose or whether it was for some other purpose that has just been adopted. So is there any evidence to support all these theories that we just kind of were discussing through? Well, if you look at archaeological records and evidence, we know that humans have been musical for a very, very long time, and that instruments that were we have artifacts of instruments that are at least 50,000 years old. That these are flutes that are that have been developed or have been made out of bone, or and we likely think that the earliest instruments were probably made out of biodegradable things like reeds, or pieces of wood, that sort of thing. So we probably don't have the earliest instruments we can find, but we do have some very, very old instruments. And we also have Well, we also believe that probably the earliest musical behaviors were vocal or some sort of body percussion. Um, so we do have a sense that humans have been musical for a very, very long time. Anthropologically, we know that every civilization that has been examined by anthropologists, all of them have had some sort of musical culture within them. And so the fact that every known human culture, even those that are separated geographically, has some sort of musical behavior seems to suggest that there is something um, there is something purposeful about musical behavior. Um, and not only that, but music serves familiar functions in all these diverse cultures. They're used as rituals, they're used as lullabies, they're used as work songs. There's a lot of similarity um, into the functions of the music that's used in these different cultures. We're going to talk in just a few minutes about universals, about how the music is similar amongst all these very diverse cultures, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Cross-species research also kind of lets us figure out evolutionary um, uh, origins of music. And the reading that you did kind of talked on this. So cross-species research, looks at humans and other species and what musical behaviors they can or cannot do. And so there's essentially, and this is kind of how the reading was broke up, there are abilities that are widespread amongst species, there are abilities that are restricted to humans and select other species, and then there are abilities that are uniquely human. And so the behaviors that are widespread, which this is it's kind of weird to think about how other animals might be able to perceive or understand music, but the evidence suggests that animals of, especially lots of mammals, can distinguish between different discriminate between different tempos. So they can tell when something is fast or something slow. The text kind of suggests, well, that could be, so that they can know if a prey is coming quickly at them, or if they, you know, um, if they know that they're in harm's way, and also that they can perceive pitch. They can even be trained to recognize intervals. Remember, though, in the reading, though, it says that animals are, non-human animals, for the most part, do not have relative pitch. So even if you train them on to recognize intervals, they probably will only recognize those intervals at those exact pitches. So if you train them to teach, to know a perfect fifth versus a perfect fourth, if you then translated that to a different perfect fifth, they would not recognize that. Interestingly, that they also understand the missing fundamental, which we listened to that in the previous lecture, where you've got your fundamental and then you've got all your partials above it. But if you take the fundamental away, the partials above it, with just those there, we still perceive that the fundamental is there, and we hear the note that is that fundamental tone. So other animals, that if you do that same thing, they recognize it without that fundamental there. So that means that there are something away about how we perceive just sounds that's very similar to how other animals do that. And then lastly, the other thing that's really widespread is um, that there is an emotional representational representation of sound. So in the reading, it talked about they could play sounds that were reminiscent to I think it was bonobos. I think it was when they were talking about that they would play, the agitated sounds versus, the pleased sounds, and then they wrote a cello piece that kind of use some of those sounds and they reacted to it. So it shows that within the sounds that they can associate some sort of emotion, and that kind of gets into the question of does the music, does it create the emotion, or is the emotion embedded within the organism already? We're not going to talk about that at this point, but so yeah, so tempo discrimination, pitch perception, the the missing fundamental that they can do that as well, and that there is some that there's emotional representation within sound. That's pretty much widespread in lots of different species, or at least it's been noticed in lots of different species, particularly mammals. Um, some things um, that are some musical behaviors that are in humans, but are in just some select groups of species, include drumming in apes, great apes, and that's where, and again, it's just certain great apes. It's not like chimpanzees do it, but not orangutans. Uh, so it's not all great apes. It's just some of them, and so that's where we come to this vocabulary word homology, which shows that humans and chimpanzees and other great apes that do this drumming, that there could be a common ancestor that have a similar trait. So so that's one instance of human sharing a trait with another restricted group. It also appears that that humans, as well as some animals, that they prefer consonant sounds versus dissonant sounds. And again, in the reading, it said this is kind of suspect. We really don't know if we can say that, because humans when they're born, they can hear the environment outside of their mother, and so it could be that humans are already in some ways conditioned to like consonant sounds, because that's what's mostly in our music, especially Western popular music. So it could be that that's already some sort of conditioning to do that. But so there's still work to be done there to really understand if humans and or other species prefer consonant sounds. And then one of the other behaviors that has been noticed in the research literature is synchronizing in vocal learners. So both humans and birds that can talk, specifically two birds that can talk, one a cockatiel, I think, and one a parrot. They can synchronize to a beat. They can entrain to a beat, and it's very perplexing that of all the animals that are out there, that only these birds seem to be able to synchronize to an external beat. And the hypothesis was, and I guess it still is that there might be that there's some connection with this ability to synchronize with vocal mimicry. Because, right, parrots and birds, like, they can mimic the sounds that they hear, but they don't actually understand the words that are coming out of their beaks, right? So, so they were thinking that, so the hypothesis is that there's something about the brain of these birds that is similar to human brains, and that mimicry piece somehow allows us to coordinate our movements to a synchronized beat. And we call this when two very distant, we're not even in the same kingdom as birds, right? no, animals are the kingdom, so we're in the same kingdom. But um, birds are not mammals, so we are very, very distant from birds. Um, so we call this a convergence, which it means that perhaps evolutionarily, whatever caused them to be able to use that mimicry thing has, their brain circuitry has done something that is similar to what we do. So we call that convergence. Um, and so you can see that I'm going to post a link to one bird that is, he's in training to a rock song. I want to say it's Who Let the Dogs Out. I'm not sure. But I'll put a link there, and that's Snowflake doing that. And one thing about this that we don't know, even though the bird can entrain to the beat, we have no idea what visual stimuli the person behind the camera or the people, on the other side of the room, what they're doing. They could be trying to, give some sort of visual cue to help um, facilitate the synchronization. So since the last time I taught a class similar to this, there's something that's come up that's really kind of turned this whole thing on its head, because there has been a researcher, I think in California, and he's been able to get a sea lion to entrain to a beat, and to different metronome tempos, and it's very intriguing. I'm also going to put that link on there too, where you can watch the sea lion moving, on a tempo to different tempos. And so the thing about that is that kind of throws this whole idea of vocal, mimicry, out the window, because sea lions cannot mimic the same way that parrots can. So we still have a lot of figuring out to do to figure out what's going on with that. So that's when looking at cross-species research. That's between humans and one or a small group of other species. Now, the things that are exclusive to humans are what I alluded to earlier about relative pitch. Even very, very small children, if you sing Happy Birthday to them or Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and you sing them in different keys, they recognize that that's still Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. That would not be the case with animals, and it talks about that in bird songs. If you modulate the bird song, they don't recognize it. They're still trying to do some work to figure out, like, well, if we do, a descending pattern, and we get them to understand that means this thing, and then, but as far as actual relative pitch, that's really a uniquely human thing. So it's interesting if you have any friends that have perfect pitch, it could be that perfect pitch people are just not as developed as humans, and that they, it's probably not the case. What probably is going on there is that they almost have, they have connected the stimulus of certain pitches to a name, and so they always know what that name is. And people with perfect pitch, I think they'll tell you that it's both a blessing and a curse, and that's something that I'm glad that I don't have to deal with absolute pitch at all. So that's one thing that's uniquely human, is this idea that we can that there's relative pitch. Another is that we have a concept of tonality and stability when we hear musical notes. So we kind of understand this idea that the tonic gets more importance, or that it's leading to that tonic. If we sing do re mi fa sol la, do re mi fa sol fa mi re, we want to go down to do. And that's the thing, is that other creatures just don't have that kind of expectancy. And so that's kind of the cross-species research. There's still a lot to be done and to understand as far as cross-species research and musical behaviors go. Neurological research in the past 20 years, there's been a lot of it that's looked at, kind of what parts of the brain are activated. And so far, there hasn't been a holy grail found where it's like, oh, this is the music center. Um, a lot of the brain is activated when humans are engaged in some sort of music activity. And so at this point, we don't have structures that are like, oh, only music uses this. But I think some of the theories, the neurological research does seem to suggest that that there is this connection, there is some sort of link between musical behaviors and language skills. Lastly, we're going to talk about universals and that how when we look cross-culturally, we look at how different groups of people make music, how there are universals within their music. First, there's there are kind of some just basic psychological phenomena that are going on in music making that that all humans do, in how they organize their musical understanding. So first, so they use all of these Gestalt concepts, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about perception. Gestalt concepts of proximity, similarity, good continuation, and foreground. All this to say that it helps them organize acoustic information into events. So they can hear things that are happening simultaneously. So they can, so when you hear, like think about hearing a pop song. You can hear the drums and you can hear the drums and you can hear the lead singer at the same time, and you know that those are two different things that are happening at the same time. So that's simultaneous grouping. But you also can connect events into streams, which is sequential grouping. Like when you think about that expectancy of the tonic coming. Like that's another way that that humans organize the sounds that they're hearing. And lastly, humans can they create segmentational grouping, and they can chunk the information so that makes more sense to them. Oh, this is the verse, then the chorus. This is the verse, chorus. Like we can they can identify repetition and kind of break things down into groups. So you've got simultaneous grouping, you have sequential grouping, and you've got segmentational grouping. Now, there are musical features that are pretty much universal in all the across cultures of music making. And some of these universals are that we use discrete pitch levels. So there are pitch levels that we return to, and that we used fixed reference pitches, such as a drone or a tonal center. So there's some sort of hierarchy in that that fixed pitch is very important. Another universal in music across different cultures is that the octave is really a privileged interval. We always find octaves being used, and that octaves are considered equivalent, meaning that they create scales, but the octave is always the beginning of the next scale. It's not that that the octave above or below is somehow a different pitch category. So it's very similar to what we do. I mean, it's exactly what we do in Western music. All cultural musics are based on some sort of scale, which are broken up into intervals, generally of 5 to 7 pitches, and there are uneven intervals between those between the scale, or the pitches within the scale. So when you think about the Western, typical major scale, you've got whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So we have a series of uneven intervals, whole steps, half steps. And so that's pretty much how that goes around the whole world, is that, um, we have a series of 5 to 7. Some have more, some have less, but generally that's how it works. And then we also have universally, there is a use of a pulse or meter, and that there's some sort of time reference point, in that the rhythm is somehow grouped in a way that can help it be understood. The Sloboda, he's a very he writes a lot and does a lot of research in psychology of music. Sloboda says that both the pitch reference, the reference point for pitches, and the reference point for pulse and meter, they're really important for the social aspect of music. If we didn't have those things, we would not be able to coordinate, either to perform along with it, to dance to it, to sing to it. So those things are, it makes sense that those things are universal in all of the world's musics, that in order for social beings to be able to participate with each other. A couple of other universals are that there are small integer frequency ratios, meaning that consonant intervals seem to be more highly valued than dissonant intervals. And then also integer ratios of duration are more pronounced as well, meaning that pretty much, if you have like a 1:1 integer ratio of duration would essentially be simple meter, and then a 1:2 would be compound meter. Bump, ba bump, ba bump, ba bump. That would be 1 to 2. And once you get higher ratios of that, we just don't really see them in being used. So those are some of the actual musical things that are universal amongst human music making all across the world. And then lastly, and this kind of goes to some of the other things we said, is the hierarchical organization, in that we can kind of see that there is an organization to music, that there are phrases that create sections and that sort of thing. And lastly, that there is musical expectancy, that we want the chord to resolve to the tonic. We have an expectation that it's going to resolve in some way. And that's another thing that is found in and universally in world music around the world. Okay, so that is the what we're going to talk about today: the origins of music, and how music and evolution are together. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I find this very interesting, but I am by no means an expert in all of this. So if you have questions, shoot them my way, and I'll be happy to research and answer. All right, thanks. Bye.